Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the noble lie, revisited. I say revisited because my guest, Reza Jorjani, and I recorded an interview some time ago about Plato's noble lie, and we're revisiting that topic again. Dr. Jorjani is a philosopher. He is the author of Prometheus and Atlas, World State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, novel Folklore, and Iranian Leviathan. I might mention also by way of introduction that we'll be touching on some issues related to the political controversy and defamation surrounding Jason toward the end of this interview. For those of you who have raised those issues, welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure as always.
Pleasure to be with you. I guess we could start by recapitulating briefly the concept of the noble lie, I guess as first expounded by Plato.
So Plato uses the term noble lie in Republic, in his great political masterwork, The Republic, at 414 to 415 in that text, in the context of discussions about eugenics by means of arranged marriages. So, he proposes a lottery that would appear to be random, but would really combine couples in a way that would be favorable to eugenically enhancing the population. And this is where he first uses the term noble lie, but the noble lie plays a much more significant role in Republic than simply in terms of this particular policy. Another more prominent example of it is when Plato argues that the masses in any given society require some religion in order to cultivate their moral character. And he considers the Homeric folk religion of his time to have a deleterious effect on the upbringing of children. He thinks that children being raised on the Homeric epics and the customary sense of morals implicit in those are being corrupted. So he proposes that the guardians design a religion that would be more suitable to the cultivation of the ethical character of the population than the customary Greek religion, but a faith that the guardians themselves do not believe in. So this proposal that the philosopher rulers of the ideal state ought to manufacture a religious doctrine that is false but conducive to the moral development of the majority of the population is another significant example of the noble lie in Republic. Republic isn't, however, the only Platonic text where this idea of the noble lie emerges in some form. In Plato's seventh letter, Plato comes out with the shocking statement that no one has ever studied the doctrine of Plato. And if they claim they have, they're lying. This is striking because he's written tens of dialogues in which presumably he's expounded his doctrine. But the implication of the statement is that all of Plato's writings are esoteric and that he has never revealed his actual cosmology or political philosophy in a direct fashion.
Well, an esoteric culture itself existed long before Plato.
Yeah, Plato's idea of the noble lie, I think, is rooted in the lesson he learned from the fate of the Pythagorean order, a secret society that he himself belonged to. Pythagoras was at the head of a very hierarchical, elitist secret society, where even among those who belonged to the order, there was a distinction between an inner circle and an outer circle. The first man behind the curtain was Pythagoras, who literally sat behind a veil, where only his inner circle were at around his feet, and the others had to listen to him lecture from behind this curtain. And then if anyone were to reveal any of the secrets of the order to the public, the penalty was death. So the person who revealed the Pythagorean theorem, although that particular piece of information wasn't all that important, as a matter of principle, was sentenced to death. He was taken out by boat into shark-infested waters and thrown overboard by his brothers in the order. So, why was this degree of secrecy required in the Pythagorean order? Because it had a revolutionary program for the transformation of society. I mean, women were admitted, for example, into the Pythagorean order, very much against the conventional morality of the time. And the Pythagoreans were, and they also believed in reincarnation, which was at odds with conventional Greek religion. The Pythagoreans at the time were attempting to seize control of the government of Sicily. And they were positioning initiates of the order in high levels of the government. And when the traditional aristocrats became aware of this, they rallied the population against the Pythagoreans and staged basically a coup that ended with the burning of the Pythagorean schools. And people speculate that either Pythagoras died in that fire or died shortly thereafter from his injuries in the fire. And so Plato, as a member of the Pythagorean order, is looking back on the destruction of the school and realizes that since he has to operate in the Athenian agora, since he doesn't have the protection of an order like the Pythagorean schools when they were actually functioning, he has to write even more esoterically, express himself even more esoterically than the Pythagoreans did in order to advance his agenda.
So this tradition of secrecy can be found throughout, all secret societies have it. And secret societies are formed for many reasons, primarily political or esoteric. And usually the esoteric societies do, like the Pythagorean order, have political overtones.
Yes, and although it's widely acknowledged that Plato believed in such secret societies, having been a Pythagorean initiate himself, it's less commonly accepted that Aristotle was also of the same view, that Aristotle also believed in esoteric writing and in the need for secrecy as part of the philosophical project. But I would argue that he most definitely did. And one of my essays in Lovers of Sophia, one of the essays that was collected into Lovers of Sophia, called Building the Theater of Being, I argued that Aristotle is extremely duplicitous, even when it comes to some of the most fundamental elements of his cosmology and his political philosophy. So, for example, Aristotle, on the face of it, makes the statement that human beings are not the highest beings in the cosmos, and that politics is not the most important matter. Because, the stars are made of the fifth element, and so they're more rarefied and of a higher order of being than terrestrial humans. And while man is a political animal, and so politics is important for human life, since human beings are not the highest beings in the cosmos, cosmology or metaphysics is more, even what we now call natural philosophy, or what in the 17th century they called natural philosophy, is more important than politics. This is the conventionally accepted view of Aristotle. But, in fact, if you read the Nicomachean Ethics and other texts closely, I think you come away with a very different impression. If the devil's in the details. And when you look at the details of some of the remarks Aristotle makes, particularly in Nicomachean Ethics, I think you arrive at a view that's much closer to later idealism, or to the Hermetic idea of man as the microcosm of the divine, where Aristotle is supposed to have believed that God was the prime mover only in the sense that God gives purpose to all other purposes, that in the fourfold Aristotelian scheme of causality, where you have a material cause, a formal cause, and then an efficient cause that shapes matter into a particular form, and then a final cause that's the end or aim, the purpose of something. God is that ultimate purpose that makes all other purposes objective. And God's essence is pure thought, right? But there are places where Aristotle admits that man shares the same essence with God. And if you start pulling on these threads in Aristotle's text, you realize that he actually is taking the view that all of the four causes transform potentialities in nature into actual substances through human intellectual and perceptive activity. So through human noesis, higher intellectual cognition, and through human perception, all of the other beings in nature gain their actuality from out of a matrix of potentiality. So this means that man is the microcosm of the divine, and without man, God couldn't actualize the cosmos. And God plays a much more active role through human noesis and aesthesis than Aristotle lets on the face of his writing. Now this gets us back to the noble lie when we consider that remark again that man is a political animal. Because if in fact the actualization of nature is dependent on the human mind, the way that later idealists believed, and if, as I think is justified, Aristotle means it when he says that the human being requires the polis in order to be fully human, and that without a proper political system, human beings degenerate into a subhuman state and cannot really fulfill their proper function, then really what Aristotle is saying is that politics, or how to properly govern a city, is the master craft that allows being to manifest in the first place. That in effect, the guardians of the well-ordered city are also the guardians of the coming into being of all natural entities. And so this makes politics supremely important. And it becomes even more relevant to the noble lie when we consider that Aristotle drew a distinction, like Plato and like the Pythagoreans, between various rungs of human beings. From those who are most materialistically oriented, through, the common man who's pursuing various business ventures and, diverts himself with entertainment together with others and at various occasions, all the way up to people whose entire lives are devoted to intellectual cultivation. And he claims that only those people, the people who live a life devoted to thinking, are really fit to govern the state, because only they're capable of genuine friendships that are based on each other's character rather than on some shared business interest. And he goes so far as to say at one point in Nicomachean Ethics that such people really do not need society's laws. They live above society and its laws and only outwardly need to adhere to them in order to set a good example for others. And so I think when you look at these aspects of Aristotle's thought, you realize that even if he doesn't talk about the noble lie, he is practicing it, and he's practicing the doctrine of esoteric writing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think for many viewers, it would be surprising to think that Plato advocated, at least in some occasions, the application of the noble lie, since truth is considered primary. Truth, beauty, and goodness are his three values, are they not?
Sure, but Plato's view is that not everyone can handle the truth, and that if you want to aim most people toward the good, you're going to need to give them constructive myths.
Mm-hmm. And would he place the good as being higher than truth? No, but I think that there's an integral relationship between truth, beauty, and justice in Plato's worldview. But sometimes, in order to have people cultivate their character and develop their intellect to the point where they're able to apprehend the truth, you need, for pedagogical purposes, including on a social level, to give them constructive myths that will orient them away from wickedness and toward being closer to the good, mm-hmm. and toward living more beautiful lives. So I gather that this idea of truth and the importance of it, or the utility of a lie, has been taken up throughout history by other philosophers as well.
It has. And before we go on to that, and in particular to the greatest student of the idea of the noble lie, which is Leo Strauss, I just want to mention that there's a film called The Village that is a really great example of what both Plato and Aristotle mean by the noble lie. It involves a group of intellectuals in the late 20th century who decide that society is simply too violent and degenerate to be a place where children can properly be raised, and that, the society is going to destroy the character of children. So they break away from our civilization, and through the role of a billionaire who's one amongst this group of intellectuals, they buy a large plot of land that they fill with a forest and build a village in the midst of it. And this billionaire is able to prevent airplanes and helicopters from even flying over. He establishes a no-fly zone over this whole area. And the village is set up that, basically rolls the clock back to the 1600s in terms of the level of technology. So it's not like they have a religion that's similar to the fundamentalism of the Puritans. But they do have a religion that's been invented by the intellectuals who set up the society for the moral betterment of the children who are raised in it, even though those who set up the society know that the religion is false. They know it to be false themselves and don't have faith in it. But they have faith they sincerely have faith in its constructive power to promote goodness. Mm. And so, this is, I won't, tell viewers how the story ends, but I'll point them toward that film as a concrete example of what both Plato and Aristotle mean by the noble lie in practice.
And I gather the idea is that the children raised in the village know no other reality.
Yeah, and there's no crime. I mean, for a long time, there's no crime in that society. People treat each other very well. And I mean, I won't tell people how it ends, but...
No, I don't think it'll hurt to tell people the ending. I think it's crucial, actually.
Well, the society kind of unravels because evidently the founders of the society didn't agree with Plato's advocacy of eugenics, because there is a disabled child, a disabled adolescent in the village, who winds up committing a violent crime, and someone's very badly injured, and there's need for medical assistance from outside the village. And this whole society starts to unravel from there, from that crisis taking place.
So, in effect, one might say that the moral lesson of the village is that the noble lie was misapplied, or that it led to a bad ending one way or another.
Either that, or if you want to be a Platonist, you need to go all the way. And anyway, let me not elaborate on that. But someone who did go all the way as a Platonist was Leo Strauss. Mm-hmm. Leo Strauss is considered, I think rightly, the most influential Platonist in the contemporary epoch, at least when it comes to political philosophy, when it comes to elaborating on Plato's political philosophy. He was a German Jew who escaped the rise of Nazism and became a very influential professor at the University of Chicago. But before he relocated from Germany to the United States, Strauss was actually an intellectual student of Martin Heidegger, and literally a student of Carl Schmitt, men who were among the most prominent intellectuals who were also card-carrying members of the Nazi Party. And in fact, Heidegger and Schmitt joined the party on the same day, and they were standing in line together. At any rate, Leo Strauss, in an essay called Introduction to Heideggerian Existentialism that appears in his anthology on classical political rationalism, he claims that Heidegger is the only living philosopher of our time, that the only real philosopher of art, meaning the 1950s, 60s, when he wrote that essay, Heidegger was the only person worthy of being called a philosopher. And Strauss said, I myself am not a philosopher. I'm an interpreter of the history of philosophy and a political thinker. Mm. So he had that degree of esteem for Heidegger, and so
he's not the only one. I mean, Heidegger is almost universally regarded as certainly a great philosopher.
Yeah, and so one would presume that Strauss was also influenced to some extent by Heidegger and Heidegger's reading of Plato and Aristotle. Mm-hmm. And then he wrote extensive notes. Strauss wrote extensive notes on Carl Schmitt's concept of the political, Carl Schmitt's most important text in political philosophy. He wrote these extensive notes, which I think Schmitt really appreciated as maybe the most astute reflection of any of his students on the concept of the political. So that's some of his background. Leo Strauss also, I think, took Nietzsche very seriously. He wasn't just a student of Plato and Aristotle. I think he was also a student of Nietzsche and Nietzsche's critique of moderns who rejected the idea of the noble lie. Nietzsche's critique of modern rationality. So Kant, for example, Immanuel Kant, in his essay on the supposed right to lie, which is often amalgamated with the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals when it's published, Kant claims that it's never justified to tell a lie because, as he argues in the groundwork, the only actions that are ethical are ones that have a maxim that can be universalized. If your actions cannot be translated into some principle that everyone could universally adhere to as a principle for their action, then they're unethical.
This is known, I think, as his categorical imperative?
Yeah, the categorical imperative. In other words, and I see it really as a sophisticated, abstract reiteration of the do unto others Christian morality.
The golden rule.
The golden rule, yeah. So, the idea is that if the maxim of your action is be kind to others, well, that's ethical because if it were universally implemented, it would be great for society. It would benefit everybody. But if you think that you're justified in stealing in some particular instance, well, the maxim of that action can't be universalized because if everyone were to steal, if everyone were to think that way, society would be torn apart. It would disintegrate. We'd have violent chaos. And so Nietzsche levels a critique at this. Let me just point out that, in my view, this is so idiotic that it would effectively be recommending that Nazis who come to the door of some good German citizen who's hiding Jews in his attic ought to be led up the stairs to the attic and have the Jews handed over to them. Kant would expect the good moral German who has the SS pounding on their door to say, well, look, I don't want to lie. I wouldn't want to be immoral by lying, but, these people really haven't done anything wrong. I'll lead you up to them and, but please be good to them because, I think your whole approach to how these Jews should be treated is mistaken, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, clearly there are instances in which lies are justified. And so Nietzsche levels a very scathing critique at Kantian morality, which includes the argument that Kant is falsely assuming that everybody's equal. In the universality of the categorical imperative of the golden rule, in effect, assumes falsely that everyone's equal and worthy of being treated equally. Whereas, there are a lot of people who could pose very grave threats to society and need to be handled in a way to minimize their potential damage. And it's wrong to suggest that they should be accorded the same degree of respect or are owed the same honesty as very principled and, principled and reflective individuals.
So Leo Strauss would agree with Nietzsche's critique of Kant.
Yes. And so I think that although Strauss is widely characterized as a classicist, his reading of Plato and Aristotle is, if not fused with Nietzsche, mediated through his understanding of Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm. And now Strauss himself was also the tutor to a whole generation of people at the University of Chicago who later became identified with the neoconservative movement, particularly under George W. Bush and the first Iraq War.
That's right.
Or the second, I should say.
That's right. Paul Wolfowitz and other key members of the Bush administration were students of Strauss's school. And
he himself was what you might regard as a neoconservative thinker.
Who?
Leo Strauss.
You know, I don't think that's fair to say, honestly. I think that the man's genius as a political thinker transcends the confines of any particular school of thought. It's often the case that schools of thought take shape around somebody whose actual intellectual enterprise is much more sophisticated and insightful than what his students are able to understand from out of him. And I would say that about Leo Strauss.
So
his students are neoconservatives.
His students, so he was an inspiration to that movement.
Yeah. But what's ironic is, some people also call that group of intellectuals classical liberals. And I'll get into why momentarily. It has to do with the liberal ideology at the foundation of the United States and what Strauss had to say about that. He didn't limit himself to lecturing on Plato and Aristotle. He also lectured and wrote extensively on the political philosophers who were foundational to the Constitution of the United States, the political thinkers who were studied by the framers of the U.S. Constitution, the books that were being read by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and so on and so forth, like the works of Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke. Mm-hmm. So in his book, Natural Right and History, Strauss goes on at length about these early modern political thinkers. And he claims that they also were employing esoteric writing, which was lost on a lot of their interpreters, and even on some of the framers of the Constitution. He finds evidence of esoteric writing in Hobbes and Rousseau and Locke, which, he believes they employed in order to avoid persecution because the church was still very powerful in the 1700s.
And they were generally regarded, I believe, as the Enlightenment rationalists.
Yes. And there is a deist cosmology in the writings of some of these figures, particularly John Locke, that's adopted by the framers of the Constitution, such as Thomas Jefferson, or the author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. And whether or not Jefferson realized this himself, the belief that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights is based on a cosmology that is not defensible. It's not metaphysically defensible. It certainly can't be upheld after one engages with the Darwinian theory of evolution in as serious a manner as Nietzsche did. And again, Strauss is a student of Nietzsche, not just of Plato and Aristotle. So Strauss comes to the realization in his writings on the American Constitution that the United States is founded on a lie. That, the true Constitution of the United States, and here he's being a good student of Carl Schmitt and of how Carl Schmitt understands sovereign order and of what it really means to have a constitution. Strauss claims that the true Constitution of the United States, the document that constitutes the country and reveals its existential foundation, is not the actual U.S. Constitution, it's the Declaration of Independence, which justifies the breakaway from Britain in the first place. And the Declaration of Independence is woven around a lie, namely that all men are created equal and endowed by some grand architect of the universe with inalienable rights.
And it was an obvious lie at the time because Jefferson and Madison and other founders established slavery.
Well, see, I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
I really don't agree with that. I think that Thomas Jefferson, there were certain social and political realities of the time, mm-hmm. such as slavery. It was a deeply entrenched aspect of the economic system of the colonies. Yeah. And my reading of Thomas Jefferson as a human being mm-hmm. is that he was basically against slavery and would like to have seen a society without slavery. But he considered it an idealistic goal. And like all people, he was imperfect and didn't live his life in an entirely consistent fashion and was subject to some degree of hypocrisy. But I do think that Jefferson, at least, I'm not as familiar with Madison. Jefferson would have liked to get rid of slavery. So, look, I don't know, whether Jefferson realized that he was promulgating a noble lie when he used those words in the Declaration of Independence. But at this point, they are a noble lie. Sustaining that faith is, in fact, promulgating a noble lie. And Strauss thinks that it ought to be done because the United States of America is promoting a degree of freedom and a space for the cultivation of the individual, including through its economic system, that has never been on offer from any other society in history. And there are all these other societies that could potentially threaten the human individual with terrible forms of tyranny. I mean, at the time Strauss was a professor at the University of Chicago, you had, you're just barely coming out of the Stalinist phase of the Soviet Union. So you had the tyranny of Soviet communism. You had Chinese totalitarianism. And then ultimately, I think the students of Leo Strauss wound up seeing Islamic fundamentalism as another source of tyranny, threatening the kind of freedom the United States was defending on a global scale.
And Strauss himself had to flee Nazi Germany.
Exactly. So Strauss thinks that even if the United States is founded on a lie, it's a beautiful lie. And this lie needs to be perpetuated in order to, practically speaking, continue to guarantee freedom for people in the face of concrete threats, in the face of real enemies, existential enemies, to use language from Carl Schmitt, who was Leo Strauss's teacher.
Well, I can well imagine that a thinker like William James might look at that statement in the founding document and say it may not be provable in any sort of ontological or metaphysical sense that all people are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, but from a pragmatic point of view, it's true because it works.
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap between William James and Nietzsche in that respect. Nietzsche often says very much the same thing that James does, or vice versa, except that Nietzsche says it in a more provocative and incendiary way. So the truth is what works, what's practically beneficial, is basically what Nietzsche meant when he said that over the course of history, the will to truth reverses itself and reveals itself to be the will to power. What Nietzsche means by the will to power is that pragmata is the ultimate criterion. Whether a belief, whether a scientific paradigm, affords us a greater latitude of action and is empowering and fosters greater creativity should be the criterion by which it's judged. And that's, effectively what William James is saying as well. So there is this parallel between James and Nietzsche. And anyway, now that I mentioned that, let me just elaborate briefly on the will to truth. Nietzsche thinks that Plato's postulation of a transcendental realm as the ultimate standard of reality, of truth and objectivity, eventually leads to the decline of society into nihilism, because it's recognized that this transcendental realm is hollow, that it's a posited, a projected ideal. And the effects of that are so demoralizing that there's a reversal of the will to truth, and it's ultimately recognized that all of the expressions of the will to truth, including the Judeo-Christian sense of morality and the doctrines of the church, are actually rationalizations of various subconscious drives and passions and deep, dark motivations in the recesses of the human psyche. And this is where Nietzsche and Freud overlap to some extent.
Well, a counter view might be that the experience of mystics, the experiences of people who have had a near-death encounter, affirm the existence of a transcendental realm.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with that at all. And I argued that at length in Prometheus and Atlas, that actually a thorough interpretation of the vast array of parapsychological evidence should complete the deconstruction of the idea of any objective reality. Because what it does is it breaks down completely the distinction between the subjective and the objective. But that's a whole other discussion we could have. We could refer viewers to our conversation on the spectral revolution in that respect.
Well, hopefully we'll have many future discussions, Jason, and that would be a good one.
Yes. So, we definitely would do well to revisit that idea of the spectral revolution before long. In any case, Strauss, I think, really bought this Nietzschean narrative about the reversal of the will to truth over the course of history, and the recognition that really what's being expressed is a will to power. And when we come up with new scientific paradigms and subscribe to their objective validity, what we're trying to do is empower ourselves by giving us a model that's going to afford us the ability to develop types of technology that we haven't been able to thus far, and types of technology that will give us more control over nature. Just the same way that the doctrines of the church in the medieval period gave the church more control over the passions of the masses of people in society. So I think this is part of Strauss's justification for the noble lie, is a recognition that, the truth is what is most useful and empowering. And if it's useful to believe that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, like the right to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of the press and so on and so forth, then the lie that makes the kind of society that honors those rights possible is a lie that ought to be promulgated.
Well, it seems as if Leo Strauss's students, the neoconservatives, encouraged the Second Gulf War based on the myth of weapons of mass destruction. Presumably they knew it was a myth. It's now well understood to have been an untruth. And they must have felt that this was a noble lie in their pursuit of, American hegemony in the Middle East.
They may also have thought that provoking a civilizational war with the Islamic world would somehow revitalize faith in the fundamental principles of America and the moral superiority of America on a global scale. That's also possible. It might not only have been about resource acquisition, but in any case, I consider it a despicable misapplication of the idea of the noble lie, and one that I very much doubt that Strauss would have endorsed. This lie that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and that somehow Saddam Hussein had anything to do with Al-Qaeda, when the Ba'athist secular Arab ideology was diametrically opposed to the ideology of an organization, Al-Qaeda, which after all was created by the United States in Pakistan to be sent into Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a despicable misapplication of the idea of the noble lie. And I want to give another political example, which is, the disclosure movement and its relationship to the UFO cover-up, and look at the noble lie in that context. But on the way to that, I also do want to stick my neck out and address the truther movement briefly, since you brought up, the Second Persian Gulf War. The war that, in effect, we're in still to this day as a result of the decision to tell these lies. In that context, I want to say something about the truther movement, because it defines itself as a movement for truth, namely the truth about what happened on 9/11. And, this is something I've looked into. I haven't talked about it, and I'm going to tell you why I haven't talked about it. But I've looked into it. In particular, I would refer viewers to David Ray Griffin's research. He's a philosophy professor, most well known for his elaboration of Whitehead's process thought. And he's done extensive research as one of a group of scholars who are seeking, the truth about 9/11, quote unquote. And I find some of his arguments convincing, I'll admit publicly for the first time. I think that it's fairly obvious when you look at the evidence that those towers were brought down in a controlled demolition. And I'm inclined to think that a missile went into the Pentagon and not an aircraft. And that raises all kinds of disturbing questions. Okay. But where this is most relevant to the noble lie is this. If a conspiracy actually took place on 9/11, then that's being covered up by a lot more people than the ones who actually perpetrated the conspiracy. We have a vast national security apparatus, many parts of which would have become aware of what happened on that day, and that the publicly disseminated narrative is false. So then the question becomes, why are all of these people complicit in a potential lie? And is their complicity noble? Okay, are they nobly concealing the truth about what happened on 9/11? And I would suggest that it's possible that's the case, because it may not be that 9/11 was quote unquote an inside job. When you use the phrase 9/11 was an inside job, you're alleging the U.S. government attacked the United States. Well, what is the U.S. government? The U.S. government consists of, I don't know how many postal workers and people in every government agency, including the CIA, rank and file members of the CIA, who are sincerely serving their country and making things work in a society that is freer than most other societies in the world. And I think that it's a distinct possibility that some of these respectable scholars for 9/11 truth haven't considered that really what happened on 9/11 is that a group of people who for a very long time have penetrated and infiltrated various rungs of the United States national security apparatus acted from within it to undermine this country and to ensnare us in a very long-term war, which we're still in today, that is potentially going to bring about the downfall of this country, the way that the Soviet adventure in Afghanistan brought about the unraveling of the communist system and the disintegration of the Soviet Union.
And in fact, before this interview gets aired, we will have already aired our conversation on the breakaway civilization. I can link to it now in the upper right-hand corner of the screen if viewers of our current discussion want more background on that.
That's what I'm alluding to, and that's also relevant to where I wanted to end up here, which is a discussion of the disclosure movement, because that's also a truther movement. It's also a movement that insists on the morality of being as honest as possible and on having full disclosure, including with respect to the UFO phenomena. And I would ask viewers to consider this, especially those of them who are more familiar with the UFO phenomenon. There are abduction cases that involve the extraction of genetic material from people who have been stolen away from their homes in the middle of the night, and hybrids that are being engineered using this extracted genetic material. And to make a long story short, abductees are claiming that they have children that they're separated from, that are hybrids of themselves and whatever these entities are, and just contemplate the horrendously unethical behavior that's involved there on the part of these technologically superior entities. Consider also cases similar to the cattle mutilation type of case that's been studied for decades by Linda Moulton Howe. Linda Moulton Howe has done decades of research on the cattle mutilation phenomena. And at least the earlier cases of cattle mutilations can't be explained by laparoscopic surgery or any of the more recent medical techniques we've developed. And even considering those techniques, I mean, these things happen out in fields and, in places where it will be impossible within the time frame involved to, send some team of surgeons to do laparoscopic surgery. So I think that the cattle mutilation phenomenon is quite legitimate, and she's demonstrated that very effectively. But there are cases of human mutilation that are similar to the cases of cattle mutilation. There's a book, The Alien Menace, which I think has a foreword by Jacques Vallée, where some cases of human mutilation that are identical to the cattle mutilation type are detailed, and the coroner's reports, the autopsy reports on the people who turn up mutilated in this fashion suggests that they were subjected to this treatment while they were still alive, because you can tell from the reaction of tissue, whether someone, whether certain wounds are inflicted on a person while they're alive or not. And you can also tell from the adrenaline content, in the cadaver. So, there are cases where people were horribly mutilated while still alive. They were drowned in salt water, at which point they suffocated, and then their bodies were dropped down onto rooftops to be discovered, and taken to coroners. What sane government who was aware of this kind of data in relation to UFOs would come out and tell the public that there are technologically superior entities that are capable of stealing you and your children away in the middle of the night and horribly mutilating them. And there's no way that we can protect you or your property or guarantee you any of the securities that you're supposed to have as a tax-paying citizen. No president of the United States should be expected to come out and make a statement like that until and unless we have the capability to defend ourselves against that kind of a threat. So I think that there's a good argument. And, recently, in relation to these reports of the Tic Tac UFOs that were cited by U.S. naval vessels and U.S. naval pilots, the U.S. Navy came under pressure to release its files on these, encounters with these Tic Tac UFOs to engage in full disclosure on the subject. And they said that if they were to do so, it would pose, quote, a grave threat to national security, unquote. So what is it that they know about the UFO phenomenon? Is it that they are aware of these cases of human mutilations? Is it that the hybrid phenomenon is real? So I think that, one needs to look at the idea of the noble lie in this context as well. I mean, a perfect example of a lie that might be noble is the UFO cover-up. Until and unless the United States, or for that matter, any other government, has the capability to defend the denizens of Earth from whoever is perpetrating these crimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, very thought-provoking, and I think, as I promised our viewers in the beginning, I want to, with this context now, to look at some of the issues that have been raised by viewers in response to your recent book, Iranian Leviathan, and your potential application of the noble lie in your work in behalf of the Iranian Renaissance organization that you were once affiliated with, and Iranian politics in general.
Sure. So let's go into that.
Okay. I'll let you start.
Well, do you have any particular angle?
Well, okay, yes. Specifically, it was brought to my attention in the book, Jason, that there's a point at which you argued that the Iranian people should be free to engage in genetic engineering and remove Turkish and Mongol genes from amongst the population. And I have to tell you, and I've told you right away as soon as I learned of it, that I found that offensive.
Okay, so before I substantively address this issue, let me just make a very specific remark about eugenic applications of biotechnology. My view on that, whether it's in Iran or in America, is that a wide range of uses of biotechnology should be permitted to individuals, including for the sake of enhancement of intelligence. And so I'm an advocate of the use of eugenic eugenic use of emerging biotechnologies like genetic engineering and embryo selection in Iran, or for that matter, in the United States. When we come to the question
I wouldn't quarrel with you there either.
Yeah. So, but here's the thing. So it may be the case that you're less familiar with the Iranian sociopolitical atmosphere, and when the Turks and the Mongols came to Iran, they genocided about half of the Iranian population taken together. They committed horrendous atrocities. I mean, pillars of heads piled up in cities like Esfahan by Tamerlane. They raped many, many Iranian women and decimated particularly the intellectual elite of the country that resisted them. So I think it's legitimate to argue, I mean, especially since this came on the tail end of the zenith of the flourishing of Iranian arts and sciences, what's commonly referred to as the Islamic Golden Age, which was mostly based in Iran, which consisted about 90% of Persian scientists, was brought to an end by the Turkic and Mongol conquests of Iran. I mean, that is a historical fact, that period ended when those conquests took place. And so the intellectual elite of the country was decimated by illiterate nomads who came from out of Central Asia and who behaved in an incredibly violent fashion, and devastated what had been a very harmonious and a society that was progressive both in terms of science as well as the humanities, as well as arts and literature. That's I think a pretty solid historical fact that I point out in Iranian Leviathan. So, you know, the Iranian population might opt to get rid of genes that are associated with the Turkic and Mongol genetic stock, because they may see them as traces, reminders of this genocide that was perpetrated against the Iranian people. I mean, that's, I think, very understandable psychological reaction on the part of a population, right? So it's not, I'm not getting this idea out of nowhere. If you allow eugenic uses of emergent biotechnologies in Iran, there would be a whole host of people who would want to remove the genes of populations that had committed genocide against the Iranian people, whether they're Turks, Mongols, or Arabs.
Well, I think it's fair to say that much of the world harbors racist ideologies.
Yes, but let me say something in that respect.
Yeah.
In the Iranian nationalist movement, which I operated in at the highest level for quite a while, there's a racist sentiment that is as severe as what you saw in 1930s Germany or, 1920s Italy. And my concern when I was composing Iranian Leviathan as a monumental history of Iranian civilization was to prevent these racist impulses from resulting in the worst geopolitical consequences that are imaginable in our contemporary epoch. So what you see in the Iranian nationalist community is a rabid hatred of Arabs for having brought Islam to Iran. And anti-Arab ethnic sentiments, the hostility toward the Arab ethnicity is conflated with opposition to Islam as a religious ideology. They're thoroughly conflated. Even if in public statements, various Iranian nationalists will say, we have no problem with Arabs. We just have a problem with Islam as an ideology. That's not the case. They blame the Arab race for destroying Iran through the Islamic conquest. And there's a very real danger I saw when I was involved in this community, that there's a very real danger that if a nationalist movement seizes control in Iran, even if some of the initial leaders of that movement are relatively well-meaning and reasonable people, they will lose control of the situation by promulgating a narrative that is diametrically opposed to Islam and considers it a totally destructive force in Iranian history. They will, even if inadvertently, unleash a race war against the Arabs. I think you will see a situation where Iran will find itself pitted against 20 Arab countries. By comparison to today, when Iran has a very wide reach through the through the Shiite Arab world in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, you'll see an Iran that's not only isolated from the entire Arab world, but that is on the verge of a horrific ethnic conflict with the Arab world. Because a narrative would be promulgated that Islam is an Arab religion that led to the catastrophic destruction of Iranian civilization. Okay, to the terminal decline of Iranian civilization. And the Arabs are going to be held racially responsible for this. So I tried to tell a story about Iranian history that shifted the blame for Iran's civilizational decline from the Arab Muslims to the Turks and the Mongols. Because anyone aiming at a sound strategic analysis of that part of the world would realize that there is no possibility for war between Iranians and Turks. Whether the Turks of Turkey or the Turks of Central Asia, these are not strategic enemies of Iran. There are not scenarios that you can game out where Iran is going to wind up at war with the Turks of Uzbekistan or, let alone Turkey itself. And then forget Mongolia. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that simply because the Iranians consider Mongols responsible for the decline of their civilization, there's going to be a war with Mongolia. It's absurd. Okay? So, in my narrative in Iranian Leviathan, I shifted the emphasis onto the Turkic and Mongol genocides of Iran rather than the Arab-Muslim onslaught, because there's no possibility that that narrative can translate into a regional war that's a racial war between Iranians and Turks and Iranians and Mongols. But there's a very real possibility that a neo-Zoroastrian revival movement that's radically anti-Arab will eventually result in a Persian-Arab race war that will either end in the physical destruction of Iran, because Iran is surrounded by 20 Arab countries, or it will end in the moral destruction of Iran, a situation where Iran proves militarily capable of defeating all of these Arabs taken together, but has to do so through, say, a nuclear war, through some kind of a nuclear holocaust. And, that should not be the opening chapter of the story of an Iranian Renaissance. An Iranian Renaissance that begins with a puritanical Zoroastrian state in a genocidal war with Arab Muslims that it considers responsible for the decline and fall of Iranian civilization, is not going to set the kind of example to the rest of humanity that an Iranian Renaissance should.
Mm-hmm. So, in effect, I guess it might be fair to say that your involvement at that time and the Iranian Renaissance organization and that movement was an effort to assume a leadership role in the movement for the purpose of guiding it in a different direction.
That's right. It's exactly what I tried to do with the alt-right.
Yeah. And because at this point, when this video is released, we will have also released a video giving more details about your involvement in the alt-right. And once again, it was an effort on your part to assume leadership in a movement to guide it in a different direction.
That's right. That's right. I don't generally apologize for anything, but, let me take the opportunity to apologize to any Turks who may have been offended by that. Because the fact of the matter is that I have absolutely no negative sentiment toward Turks. And in actuality, had I been able to attain some prominent position of influence in Iran's political future, I'd have probably proposed a deep strategic alliance with Turkey. I have a vision, have had a vision in the back of my mind for some time of a kind of Treaty of Tabriz, of a far-reaching NATO-type strategic alliance between Iran and Turkey that would involve the Persianate world, like Afghanistan and Tajikistan and Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as the Turkic parts of Central Asia. Tabriz being a city where there are many Turkic speakers, a city where, Rumi lived for some time, who's widely revered in Turkey, and a city that's been central to Iranian history and the capital of Iran for some time, would be the perfect symbol or emblem for such a Treaty of Tabriz. And my grandfather also spent a lot of his time in Tabriz, setting up the literature department of the University of Tabriz. So this is a vision I've had in the back of my mind, and, I have nothing against Turks. And I have nothing against any group of people, on an ethnic basis. I don't have a trace of racism anywhere in my being. Other than my fiancé, my best friend is a black man. The people who've leveled these allegations against me haven't read my work in any depth, and they have zero understanding of my character or how I actually conduct my life.
Well, maybe that's a good note to end on, Jason. I can just say now I've known you for quite a few years. I consider you a friend. And I expect to have you back on New Thinking Aloud many, many more times. As far as I'm concerned, you have been misunderstood and mislabeled. And I know people point to all kinds of snips and snatches of statements you've made elsewhere, never on this channel, to justify their projection of you as some kind of a nefarious individual. And as far as I'm concerned, I see just the opposite. I see somebody with a good heart.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And I welcome you into my home and will continue to do that, I would say, probably as long as we're both alive together.
Yeah, I mean, if people want to know who I am, they should ask him. And they should ask people like Selwyn Griffith, to whom I dedicated Lovers of Sophia. These are the kind of people who really know me and who've been a part of my life in a personal way.
Well, thank you once again, Jason, for opening up about these difficult issues. I know that the pressure on you and the accusations pointed at you have made your life very difficult. So I'm grateful that you're able to be with me.
And I'm grateful for your support, Jeffrey, as always. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.